One of the things that I love to do is when I go to, maybe I'm on holiday, I'm visiting a church, or I get invited to one of those meetings, one of those meetings that you sometimes get invited to in lots of different places by well-meaning Christian people. One of the games I love to play is the Jesus game. Okay? And how the Jesus game goes at this, think of it, any service, any meeting of God's people, any whole thing, what I love to do is just silently count how many times Jesus got a mention. Okay? I would encourage you to do that. Next time you go to church or a meeting or whatever, play the Jesus game. How much of a mention does he get? It's possible to go to a whole church service and only hear Jesus at the grace at the end. Did you know that? It's possible. How do you know how I know that? Because I've played it. And I've counted, and I thought, oh, well, at least Jesus got a mention at the end. And don't get me started on committee meetings and all that sort of thing. But I have to say that here at Arran Baptist Church, Jesus gets centre stage. Doesn't he, guys? Yeah, of course he does. Of course he does. And I'm saying that because sometimes you're part of this thing called the church, and it's it's after Jesus Christ, and you think, well, how central really is he in the midst of what we're doing? It is so easy to be a part of a religious system, and yet for the religious system to become the thing that we're about and not Jesus. And there's been a couple of times, at least one very specific time in my life, where I figured that the system that I was in had become more than the Jesus Christ that we wanted to follow, or that I at least wanted to follow. And that's my first question for you this morning. In the whole panoply of your life, in everything that you do, and everywhere you go, the places where you normally worship, and if you worship here among us, is Jesus the absolute crowning centre of everything that we are? Does everything point towards him? Does everything glorify him? Does everything lift him up? Is everything sung about him, said about him? So that when you come away, you not only feel that you've met with God's people centred around Jesus, but you've met with Jesus yourself in whatever way. Is that your experience? Oh, and sometimes you have to say, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure always. Jesus is not just some nice religious character who did some nice stuff in the Gospels. He's not just that. He's not just the story that we tell to the children and then move on, as I was saying last week. He is the absolute linchpin of our faith and our life, and the key, the very key to understanding God himself. He is everything. He's the cornerstone, he's the foundation, he's the walls, he's the furniture, he's the roof, he's the one that fills the presence of the place. He's absolutely everything. He's all, and in all, and through all, and everything is for him. But we have to go back to the Old Testament to see what is going on here, what God is trying to do when he makes himself known to a people. We know that God called Abraham, and that the relationship begins, and Abraham begins to grapple who exactly is this God, and so the revelation continues and it flows until we get to the stage where we see passages like Deuteronomy chapter 6. And the law has been given, it's becoming more defined. Here's what it means to follow this God of Israel, but actually the God of all. And we have the Ten Commandments, but then we have Deuteronomy chapter 6. And there's something very specific happening here. You see, if you were living in the ancient Near East, and it was a couple of thousand years or so before Jesus comes along, and you hadn't heard of this God who is the God of all and the creator of all and the God of Israel, every single day of your life would be a trial. Imagine this: you wake up in your wee tent in the desert, and you have to walk past the mountains, through the forest, to the river, in order to get your water, to do your basic stuff of the day. Okay, imagine the scene. You're in your tent, you have a wee walk to the water, and you've got things to do. You might get up and just sort of pick up your pail, off you go to the water and come back. Not so if you were living several thousand years before Christ, because before you even set out of the boundaries of your tent, you had to appease the gods. You had to appease the God of the desert, who might bury you in sand. You had to appease the god of the trees that might fall down before you and crush you. You had to appease the god of the water and the god of the sea creatures, lest you might be eaten. And you had to appease this God who was in charge of this particular area. You had to appease this God. And you had to do all of that before you got your water in the morning. And if you were feeling that you didn't particularly like the local gods, then you would have to go somewhere else and chance it with the other gods in another place that might be more sort of generous to you. That's what life was like. And then comes the God who's been revealed in Scripture. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. He is the God over absolutely every single thing. He's not bound to particular geographical features or particular bits of landscape. He's not even bound to geography. No, this is the God who is the God of everything and everywhere. And because He's the God of everything and everywhere, all of your life comes under Him. The clarion cry of the Old Testament is Yahweh is God. The God who is revealing Himself to you is the God of everything. And the invitation of the Old Testament, to sum it up in one short sentence, is this: bring your life in alignment under Him. Bring your life in alignment under Him. And the simple instructions for the people of Israel was, well, that means that, when you're sitting at home, you talk about Him. When you're talking to your children, you talk about Him. You get God's law and you even tie it on your hands. You do physical stuff that reminds you that all of your life is about Him. You get a little bit of scroll and you attach it to your door so that every time you go out, every time you come in, you remember all of life is about God. Because how many of you I've got a good forgettery? Anyone got a good forgettery? Do you even remember what you're doing right now? Why you came here this morning? You're probably wondering. We constantly, the story of the Old Testament is we constantly need to remember what God has done. All of life comes under Him, and all of our life should point towards Him. Yahweh comes and He reveals Himself to the Lord as the Lord of all. Now, how does that go for the people of Israel? Do a quick cast over your Old Testament knowledge. How does that go for them? Well, we read that often their forgettery is more efficient than their remembering. There's whole cycles of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, of sin and righteousness, faithfulness, unfaithfulness. And so it continues and continues and continues. But one thing that doesn't change is God is still the God who rescued them. God is still the God who redeemed them. And God is still the God who brings them back, even although He might have to send them into some sort of distant land in order to remember the one who called them. When He sends them out of their own land, even there they find, the Lord is still God. Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go? If I go to the far side of the ocean, there your love is. If I go to the depths of the sea, there you are. You are unescapable. You are the God of everything. And so my only option is to continue to bring my life back before Him. This is our worship. And there is nothing in your whole life that God is not interested in. He's interested in your participating in the body of Christ. Of course He is. But He's interested in your parenting and your grandparenting and your friendships and your art and your creating and in your work and in your music making and in your golf playing and whatever it is you folks do. He's interested. And our whole lives are to become expressions of worship as we offer our lives back to Him. Now, this idea that Yahweh is Lord is a strong idea in the Old Testament. But in order for it to be really imprinted upon us as people, God did the absolute extraordinary. Because He took this big concept of Yahweh as Lord, of whom there are no images or idols, and He made Himself perfectly present in the person of Jesus Christ. Listen to what Paul says when he's writing to the church at Colossae. There was all sorts of controversies around in the early church, so don't think it's just these days. All sorts of controversies around this. Well, who is this Jesus actually? And what does he mean? What is he all about? And Paul's addressing some of these problems when he writes to various churches, but particularly at Colossae. And listen to what Paul says. He's got this idea as a good Jew. God is the God of everything. But now, this God of everything is perfectly manifest in the person of Jesus Christ. And he says, the Son is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. And so the idea in the Old Testament that Yahweh is Lord comes focused like a funnel, like a laser sharp point into the person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, so that when you gaze upon him, his words, his actions and his work, you are looking at the very character of God. And Jesus said still, what's the greatest commandment? They asked him. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. Love your neighbour as yourself. And he's showing them what that looks like. He's embodying not only the way in which we are to worship God, but the character of the God that is to be worshipped. Jesus is exactly the character of God. When you look upon the face of Jesus, you see the character and the face of Yahweh. N.T. Wright, some of you love him, some of you will hate him, but he says some good things sometimes. He says this. He says, if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it means to be human, look at Jesus. If you want to know what love is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what grief is, look at Jesus. And go on looking until you're not just a spectator, but you're actually a part of the drama which has him as the central character. Our one single task in this earthly life is to look upon the face of Jesus. And so understand the God who is above all, in all, and through all. And so that our lives might become aligned to his purposes. That is the most profound prophetic utterance you will ever need to hear. Look at Jesus, and then you will know. When we come into that 2 Corinthians pattern, Paul is saying to the church, look, this is so important. This message that Jesus at the very centre is so important. It's important that we get to the stage where we don't preach ourselves. It's not about us, but it is about him. It's about him and his glory and his person and his presence. And it's on looking at Jesus that will be the difference for eternity. That will be the difference for eternity. It's not what religious group you belong to. It's not even what flavour of Christianity you belong to. It's not whether you're this or that or a next thing, or whether you like this or that or another thing. It's all about Jesus and your verdict upon him. He is the very centre, and the gospel reveals the person of Christ, and so reveals the character of God, and so reveals the way in which we need to come to know him and to name him. There were loads of religious games around in Jesus' day. There are loads of religious games around in our day. And Paul is encouraging the Corinthians and the Colossians and the Philippians and the Galatians, look, here's what we have to do. Fix our minds and get a right understanding of who Jesus is. Everything flows from there. That's important for us, but it's also important because Paul tells us that there is a force in action which is seeking to blind the minds of unbelievers. There's a veil that covers the eyes, and there's a veil that will only be lifted when the glorious light and presence and face of Jesus is held for all to see. The veil that covers the eyes of those who do not yet know who this God is that claims their whole life, it will only be lifted up, not by, nice services, not by shiny pastor, not by, whatever it is you want to, not by better parking or better toilets or nicer chairs or better programs for the kids or whatever it happens to be. Yes, that's all nice. But the veil will remain over the eyes unless the blazing, shining light of the glory of God in the face of Christ is held in the Christian community. Imagine, if you will, you're standing on the beautiful Ayrshire coast, God's own very land, and you're looking over the lovely stretch of water to this even greater paradise of the Isle of Arran. But on that day in the year when it's particularly cloudy, just that one day when it's particularly cloudy, and it means that on that particular day, the summit of our beautiful Goat Fell is unable to be seen. Okay? It's unable to be seen. Now, it's still Arran. You can still recognise it in part, but it's not the fullness of it. You'll only see the fullness of it when the cloud is lifted away. When the veil is lifted up the top of the mountains. We were coming down from Lamlash yesterday to go up to Sannox or to go for dinner, whatever it is we're doing. And there was a cloud sitting right on the top of the hills there. And you would think that was where the hill stopped because the peak of the mountain was just completely obscured. And to me, it's not Arran if Goat Fell's not there. If Goat Fell's not visible, then there's something missing. There's something lacking. It's not full. And that's just a ridiculous illustration of what the Church of Jesus Christ looks like if Jesus Christ is not at the centre. The blazing sun will come and dispel the clouds, and then you can see Goat Fell. But the sun comes and he blasts away the veil so that we can see the full glory of God. And when we see him, what do we do? What do we do? We worship. What do? We take this idea of lordship and say, well, whether I'm feeling it or whether I'm not, whether I understand it or whether I don't, here is a revelation of the God who is Lord and invites me to come under his lordship. And so I bow down. I bow down. Like Isaiah when he encounters the glory of God in his vision and when he sees the temple. When he sees the majesty and the holiness of God, he says, oh, woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips and I live amongst a people of unclean lips. And then the coal came from the altar and touched those lips and he's transformed and it's like the mist disappears and he sees and he knows that his only response is, Lord, here am I, all of me, here am I, send me. Submitting to the Lordship, bowing down before him, confessing him, forsaking our sin, realizing that we have lived outside of this God who is the Lord of all and invites us to own him as such. And we come and we bow before him. Friends, this is not some abstract theology. This is the path for our lives. And the path of following Jesus is always cruciform. You have to die before you die so that you can live before you live. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. We put it all away because we are not the Lord. We're not the Lord. He is the Lord. He is the Lord. And I'm under him. It's the best place to be. That's where fullness of life comes. That's where the abundance comes. That's where the persecution comes. That you can press into because Jesus went there before you. Because he blazed the trail. Because he's shown us that death is not the end, that persecution is not the end, but glory is the end, and we will be there and we'll see it. And why am I so confident in this? Because it's not just an abstract idea. I've discovered the joy of submitting to Jesus, seeing the glory of God, and being on his path. God has made his light shine in the darkness shine in our hearts to enable us to see the glory of God. Where? In the face, the image, and in the person of Christ. Now, each of us have to come to that point where we decide what we're going to do with Jesus. And I know many of you will have said, Lord, you are Lord, and I submit to you. I come beneath you. I come and I follow you. I submit myself to you. I was recipients of grace and restoration. But some of you are still happy to go and appease all the gods all over the place, with no certainty, with no assurance, with no hope, with no guidance. The invitation is simply to come, to look upon the face of Jesus and to see the glory of God. We preach not ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord. Let's just take a few moments to reflect and to pray and to worship him.